We remember the architects of revolution as heroes who built nations. Visionary, determined, men who drafted constitutions that would reshape the world. But what about their darkest hour? What happens when the very document they created becomes their death warrant? 72 hours that tore a revolution apart. 3 days when the Founding Fathers turned from creators to conspirators. If you value history grounded in solid evidence, subscribe and tell us which city you're watching from. This account draws on original congressional records and sealed testimonies from the military tribunal. Now, back to the story. On the morning of June 14, 1783, a lone figure stood at his study window, watching the public square below. 3 wooden platforms rose against the dawn sky, guards stationed at each corner. The scaffold stood empty now, but their purpose was clear. This man wore the dark blue coat of military command, gold epaulets catching the first light. His powdered wig, his rigid posture, everything about him spoke of authority. Yet his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, perhaps, or the cold calculation of a man who knew what was coming. Outside, soldiers in tricorn hats stood at attention, muskets grounded, waiting for orders that would change everything. By mid-morning, the council chambers hummed with tension. Candlelight flickered across aged parchment as 5 men gathered around a heavy wooden table. A globe sat in the corner, marking territories that no longer existed under old borders. Scrolls lay unfurled, their edges curled with age. An inkwell and quill rested beside leather-bound volumes, tools of law now turned to instruments of accusation. These weren't ordinary advisors. These were the framers, the original architects, who had penned the very laws now being used against them. One man gestured at a document, his finger stabbing the air. Another sat with head bowed, hands trembling. The alliance that had built a nation was splintering before the ink had dried on their greatest work. At noon, the grand hall of assembly filled with delegates. Sunlight poured through tall arched windows, illuminating hundreds of faces turned toward the rostrum. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, relics of an older regime. Paintings of historical scenes decorated the walls, silent witnesses to this new drama. 2 men stood at the center, one gesturing dramatically while pointing an accusatory finger at the other. The accused stood rigid, his face carved from stone. Around them, deputies in formal dress watched with varying degrees of shock and calculation. Some leaned forward, eager for blood, others whispered behind raised hands, plotting their own survival. The chamber that had once echoed with calls for unity now rang with accusations of treason. That afternoon, in a wood-paneled chamber thick with tobacco smoke, the real power gathered. 5 men in judicial robes sat around a table laden with documents and crystal decanters. These were the lawmakers, the legal minds, who had crafted the new order's framework. Books lined the walls behind them, volumes on philosophy, jurisprudence, natural law. A portrait loomed in the background, watching their deliberations with painted eyes. They pored over statutes and precedents, searching for legal justification for what they already intended to do. One man held up a red-bound folder, its contents damning. Another poured amber liquid into cut glass tumblers, needing courage for the betrayal ahead. Justice, they called it, but the room reeked of fear and political calculation. As twilight descended, another council convened in a different corner of the building. Men in powdered wigs bent over a massive table, examining papers stacked like accusations. Some wrote furiously with quill pens, documenting evidence real and manufactured. Others argued in heated whispers, their faces flushed with wine and anger. British insignia pins glinted on several lapels, marking allegiances that would have been treasonous mere months ago. This wasn't debate. This was orchestration. Every word scripted, every outcome predetermined. They were writing the official narrative before events had fully unfolded, ensuring that history would remember their victims as traitors, rather than founders. By evening, the situation grew desperate for those marked for elimination. In a dimly lit street, cannon and muskets lined the cobblestones as soldiers took position. Gas lamps cast long shadows across formations of troops in crossed bandolier uniforms. A lone officer stood at attention, while others adjusted artillery pieces with mechanical precision. The city had become an armed camp, every intersection fortified, every alley watched. This wasn't preparation for foreign invasion. This was internal purge, carried out with military efficiency. The revolution was eating its own children, and the streets of the capital transformed into a killing ground. At dusk, 2 officers stood at another window, pointing toward the water beyond. Autumn leaves framed the view of ships at anchor, escape routes for those with means and warning. Both men wore formal military dress, medals earned in the war that had birthed this nation now marking them as targets. Behind them, portraits of earlier leaders watched silently, founders who had died before seeing their vision corrupted. These two had been brothers in arms, planners who had coordinated strategy when victory seemed impossible. Now they plotted escape, calculating distances to neutral territory, weighing the shame of flight against the certainty of execution. As night fell completely, a solitary figure stood in darkness, staring at the silhouette of a guillotine rising through the mist. Street lamps created pools of orange light, but couldn't dispel the gloom. The machine waited in the city center, hungry for the necks of those who had built the very government now condemning them. This man wore a simple dark coat, no insignia, no marks of rank, just a citizen contemplating his fate. Behind him the government buildings loomed, windows dark save for a few, where conspirators still worked. The instrument of execution stood as a monument to revolution's cruelest irony. Those who had championed the people's justice would now feel its blade. Midnight brought the most shocking discovery. In a government archive, officials unsealed a hidden cache of documents. What they found turned blood cold. Architectural drawings spread across a table under lamplight. But these weren't plans for public buildings or monuments. These were prison schematics. Detailed layouts showing cells, guard towers, interrogation rooms. Measurements precise, down to the inch. Notes in the margin calculating how many prisoners each section could hold. Dates on the documents revealed a terrifying truth. This had been planned from the beginning. The revolution's founders had built not just a government, but a machine for destroying anyone who threatened their power. The ideals proclaimed in public squares had always hidden this darker purpose. Dawn on June 15th brought the reckoning. Soldiers burst through ornate doors, musket smoke filling the council chamber. Overturned chairs and scattered papers marked the violence of the assault. Men fought desperately with whatever came to hand, furniture becoming barricades, books becoming weapons. Sunlight streaming through tall windows illuminated the chaos. But this wasn't a surprise attack by foreign enemies. These were government troops, following orders from the very constitution the victims had authored. The revolution's children had come for their fathers, and mercy was not on the morning's agenda. By mid-morning, prisoners knelt in a stone cell, as light fell through barred windows. Former generals beside common soldiers. Architects of independence reduced to condemned criminals. A guard in a red-crossed uniform stood watch, his musket ready, his face showing no emotion. These men had once commanded armies, directed the fate of a nation. Now they prayed for deliverance that would not come. The prison that held them had been built on their orders, designed according to their specifications. They were being destroyed by the very machinery they had created. At noon, the military tribunal assembled in the Grand Palace courtyard. Cavalry formed perfect lines, their horses stamping impatiently. Cannon positioned at precise intervals, their barrels aimed at nothing and everything. A single officer on horseback faced the assembled troops, sword raised in salute. Behind him, the magnificent architecture of power rose toward the sky, columns and statuary celebrating victories now being rewritten. This wasn't a military review. This was theater, a show of force designed to intimidate any who might question what was coming. The message was clear. The revolution would tolerate no dissent, even from its own founders. That afternoon, riders departed at speed through the capital streets. Mounted officers galloped past government buildings as sunset painted the sky orange and red. Smoke rose from chimneys and something else, bonfires where documents were being destroyed. Evidence being erased. The riders carried orders to provincial commanders, spreading the purge beyond the capital. Lists of names, warrants for arrest, authorization for summary execution. By nightfall, the terror would reach every corner of the republic. No one who had helped birth this nation would be safe from its appetite for victims. As evening descended again, the hunt intensified. Citizens gathered in narrow streets, torches in hand, examining wanted posters nailed to brick walls. A young woman in a tricorn hat held her torch high, reading names while others crowded close. These were ordinary people, shopkeepers and laborers, now transformed into bounty hunters. The government had placed prices on the heads of the nation's founders, and poverty made men desperate. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Friends betrayed friends. The social fabric that revolution had promised to strengthen was tearing apart at every seam. In a candlelit war room, two officers in pristine uniforms examined naval charts and mechanical diagrams. Compasses, sextants, and navigation tools covered every surface. Scrolls detailed ship movements, troop deployments, supply lines. But this wasn't preparation for external conflict. This was internal logistics, calculating how to move prisoners to remote locations, planning executions in places where sympathetic crowds couldn't intervene. The machinery of state-sponsored murder required careful coordination, and these men approached their task with the same professionalism they'd once brought to defending the nation's freedom. The final meeting happened in secret, behind closed doors as oil lamps guttered low. 6 men huddled over architectural plans, their shocked faces illuminated by flickering light. The blueprints showed something impossible, something monstrous. Not just prison cells, but an entire system. Multiple execution grounds across the capital. Streamlined processes for mass trials. Even preliminary sketches for mechanizing death itself, making it more efficient, more industrial. The dates on these documents went back years, to the revolution's earliest days. The founding fathers hadn't just created a government. They'd engineered their own eventual destruction, built the machine that would consume them. The revolution had always contained the seeds of terror. It just took time for those seeds to sprout. By the third morning, the outcome was inevitable. The trials were formalities, verdicts written before evidence was heard. One by one, the founders faced their accusers and found no mercy. The same principles they had championed, popular sovereignty, the general will, revolutionary justice, now condemned them. They had created a system that elevated state over individual, collective over personal, ideology over humanity. And now that system functioned exactly as designed, devouring anyone who stood in its path, even its own creators. The executions happened at noon on June 17th. 23 men climbed the scaffold stairs, facing crowds that had once cheered their names. Some maintained dignity to the end. Others broke, begging forgiveness from a mob that offered only jeers. The blade fell again and again, each drop met with roars of approval. By sunset, the capital's founding generation was gone, erased by the revolution they had birthed. The ideals they proclaimed, liberty, equality, brotherhood, remained. But the men who had dreamed those dreams lay in unmarked graves, victims of their own creation. Investigators spent weeks cataloging what remained. Personal effects, correspondence, journals that revealed the progression from hope to paranoia. The founders had known, somewhere deep down, that revolution devours its children. Their private writing showed increasing fear, growing certainty that the machinery they'd built would eventually turn on them. Yet they'd continued anyway, either unable or unwilling to stop the forces they'd unleashed. In their final letters, a common theme emerged. Not regret for their ideals, but recognition that ideals without limits become tyranny. That revolution without restraint becomes terror. That building a new world requires destroying the old, but destruction, once begun, may not stop until nothing remains. If stories of power, idealism corrupted, and the price of revolution grip you, subscribe and let us know the city you're watching from. This account draws on sealed tribunal records and official government archives, reviving these forgotten days when founders became victims of their own revolutionary machinery.